So I think today I want to focus on the first 1830s dress that I made and kind of how I got over what I call the underwear speed bump, like what resources I used to make that dress and to get through making that dress. And then talk a little bit about the broader context of why we picked that decade. And we are going to touch a little bit on some of the Dawes Rolls stuff and some of the broader kind of nationality context, but I want to save most of that conversation for a specific Dawes Rolls focused video set, because I feel like it unpacks a lot of stuff. So if that's okay, that was my thinking for that with you, Lara. So my notes. So finally, first of all, so as we said before, originally we were going to make this project very centered around the 1860s, which is when we estimate Polly was about our age. That felt kind of interesting. And at first, when we first started really thinking about it, it was like, well, you know, we wanted to depict her and kind of depict her life. And then, as Lara pointed out earlier, like that sounded less fun the more that we thought about it. And kind of I'll admit, some of the elements of mid 19th century dress are very, very beautiful. I'll admit, for many people, for many costumers, some of the classic movies that depict the mid 19th century are kind of honestly usually your first big costume drama or costume thing. And it does have kind of an outsized role in our popular imagination in the United States. But
I'm going to interject here. And because I want to link this somewhere, I'm going to link it. I saw a really interesting discussion. This is going to sound very off base, but I saw a really interesting discussion on YouTube from this lady about why so many vampires are Confederate soldiers.
I either sent you that or got it from you, because I watched that too, and I thought her analysis was really, really good.
Because it really brought up a point about the kind of mythology of the lost cause in the South, in a way that I never really thought about consciously.
Well, and I think
that, and you're kind of hinting about Gone with the Wind. Let's just say Gone with the Wind.
Let's just say it. Yeah,
Gone with the
we're
Wind.
talking about Gone with the Wind.
But
I think specifically also for this era for Indian Territory. And we can touch on this more when we talk about the Dawes Rolls. You know, the big costume film for Indian Territory is Oklahoma. Mm-hmm, it's literally our state song, which, to be fair, is one of the most fun state songs ever. It's very fun. I ask people from other states what their state song is, and they often don't even know.
They don't know. Yeah,
they don't know.
No, ours by Roger Hammerstein
is the best. So, as a Native person, though, especially as a Cherokee, Oklahoma actually becomes kind of fraught when you really think about it, and when you dig into the details of even that play, the play that the musical turned into, that turned into the musical that turned into the movie. It's got this really fascinating history, and we could do a whole video about that. We might, but for most of us, that's kind of our first costume thing. And when we first started talking about this, I thought to myself, well, are we going to end up basically cosplaying Oklahoma? We didn't, but that's partly because of the decades that we chose. But that was sort of my first thought. And then the second thought I had when we were focusing initially on the 1860s was, well, how do we do this without it becoming kind of overshadowed by the cultural weight that is on the Civil War and then also Gone with the Wind? Like, to be fair, for most modern Americans, Gone with the Wind is how a lot of them picture the Civil War, which arguably might be part of why we have trouble being sensitive about it, or people can have trouble being sensitive about it. Because again, like, it's this fun, beautiful, thing that very focuses on these big abstract ideas of freedom and, rights,
chivalry,
and also just, it focuses very much on, and very much like many museum collections, the movie Gone with the Wind focuses very much on the beauty and the pageantry of kind of how these rich people perform for each other. And even like, except for in some very specific scenes where the whole point is that everyone's been destroyed by, you know, kind of gotten smashed by the war. Like there's just a lot of beauty and opulence, which is very appealing. It's appealing for a reason. So we spent a lot of time talking about that. Like I started digging up some resources for making those kinds of things. And the good bad news is that there's a lot of resources for making mid-19th century American clothing. The bad news is a lot of the people who do that kind of stuff, they can be a little concerning. And that was generally, honestly, my general concern when we started talking about it. Really, you know, originally when I first started costuming, I really skipped right from about 1780 to like 1880. Like I had this whole 100 years I just didn't want to wade into. And partly because of what resources were available and partly for aesthetic reasons, and honestly, just, you know, what I call the underwear speed bump, which is, you know, each of those major eras, you have to get into just completely different undergarments. So let me go ahead and actually start to talk about the specific thing I wanted to talk about, which was, so originally we started this project thinking we were going to do 1860s for various reasons, including, you know, honestly not being that comfortable with some of the potential optics of it, but also, you know, this project continued to progress as we progressed through the pandemic and for way future people, the COVID pandemic. And basically having now experienced, obviously not quite as significant an event as, well, actually, I don't know. Let me backtrack. Having gone through, honestly, a world-changing, world-impacting mass casualty event, which is really what COVID was, we just didn't want to dwell on another time where that happened. And it was Lara who first started saying, I don't want to focus on all the suffering that happened again during the Civil War, the Cherokee Nation. You know, it was kind of our third major upheaval in the same number of decades. A lot of people, you know, kind of became refugees. A lot of people lost everything they had again. And it was just sort of like, oh, what a, you know, that's not fun. That's not exciting to us. And part of the reason why we wanted to even delve into Polly's lifetime was not to focus on her suffering, was to focus on her resilience and her strength, and to put her again literally back into the picture. And, you know, having her kind of, you know, trying to keep things together during, you know, the third major upheaval of her life wasn't what we wanted to focus on. So originally I was kind of kidding. Like I had picked Lara up from the airport and I was driving back to my house and we were going to spend the weekend doing sewing stuff. And I kind of said, oh, you know, if we want to make people uncomfortable, we could just do an 1838 depiction for Polly because, you know, of the new Echota Treaty and all the lead up to the removal, like people that's not comfortable for anybody. And I was like, oh, wouldn't that be funny if we kind of did that? Just, it would make people really uncomfortable. And Lara kind of looks at me. And it's like, isn't the point to kind of not make people uncomfortable, but to like bring up things that are, you know, maybe a little bit uncomfortable. And so this brought us to what I'm calling now the 1830s, like late 1830s day dress, and the progenitor tear dress. The tear dress, I think we should talk about in another post that's more involved. And I wanted to focus today on the late 1830s day dress and kind of how I made it, what resources I used, and decisions I made about it. And that kind of leads us to talking about, you know, how did we decide what Polly might have dressed in that period, given that, you know, we don't really have any images of her, or really very many images at all of Cherokee women in that era. You know, was it maybe different, or was it maybe not? And originally that was kind of the first question we were looking at, was how do we again, kind of decide where on the opulence meter this person should be, given what we did know about her. And I want to be clear, the other thing that's really interesting about 1838 is that this was really the decade, the 1830s, where the definition of domestic dependent nation and the new boundaries of tribal sovereignty were being laid out in the 19th century. And the Supreme Court case that defined the domestic dependent nation was centered specifically on Cherokee Nation and women and men who were Polly's peers and friends and family. And it became deeply associated with what became the removal era of the U.S. federal Indian policy. Lots of ink has been spilled around the legal status of Cherokees in this era and their role in the American struggle to control Native people, and even kind of where they are on the spectrum around how much they hate acculturated versus not. Even as the answer to the Indian question was presumed to be that we were all going to die and not be here anymore. But to sum it up, they weren't yet American citizens. They had limited rights within the American federal court system and were routinely engaging in diplomacy with the United States throughout the period. Lara, while I silence my phone, do you want to talk a little bit about Polly's blood quantum?
Sure. Let me get those notes.
Thought I had that off. Sorry.
So the first question that comes up, besides often when you discuss being of Native American ancestry, is, besides kind of figuring out how much Native you might be, it may be considered the next logical question to say, how much blood quantum was Polly? First of all, it doesn't matter. And it goes double for this time period. Blood quantum wasn't even formally codified in federal race policy until the 1930s. We see some calculations of what's called the degree of Indian blood pop up in records as early as 1901. But when Polly was born in about 1820, the main categories in use for Cherokee people were Indian and mixed. So those are the two main groups she would have had. The supposed threat that blood quantum poses to Cherokee citizenship continues to poison our debates on the boundaries of who is Cherokee. Some people use it as an excuse to ignore the 1866 treaty, acknowledging the rights of the enslaved people freed from Cherokee bondage. And we will talk about that more on a later date. But once again, that besides that particular discussion not necessarily being relevant today, was extra relevant then. And we even have some evidence that people, even in the same family, would have considered themselves more or less, full-blooded, not based necessarily upon their ancestry or their DNA, but upon their attitude about life. So if you considered yourself someone who leaned more traditional, you might describe yourself or present yourself as full-blooded as a shorthand for saying, okay, that means that I might choose a knife versus a gun, or, it came with a bunch of other things, versus being someone who was mixed, maybe, or who identified as mixed, would have seen themselves as maybe more of a modern person, or maybe somebody who was willing to use whatever tool or whatever life choice made sense to them at that moment without feeling that they had to tie themselves to a specific tradition or a specific way of life.
And I think an important element of that is that, again, as I delve into more resources to kind of get a better sense of kind of what were people actually doing, or how did they seem to see themselves, what's really fascinating to me is it does feel like the general population, the American culture, really yearns for there to be a strict dichotomy, for you to have this transition or this tension between Indian and traditional and non-Indian and, progressive. And they seem to really, Americans seem to really yearn for there to be this like firm threshold. And we can talk more about that in another time. But what's interesting to me is that I remember growing up as a Cherokee that I never felt that pressure or tension. I never felt like that was important. And it turns out when I'm reading these 19th and earlier 20th century, letters, journals, depictions or descriptions from inside, it doesn't look like we necessarily had that either. Like that the whole tribe didn't seem to have that. And so while there were some like specific distinctions between like basically whether or not you had been able to get a hold of certain material goods or whether you'd had opportunities to learn certain skills, from our perspective as a nation, you never had people saying, well, you're not Cherokee because, you live in a plantation house and, own Africans and grow cotton and wear trousers like that. We never seem to have had as a culture an idea that made you not Cherokee. It was just like, oh, okay, you've decided you want to do these things or you've had access to these things versus not. And in fact, I found a really good reference that I'll talk about more when I do a more formal presentation about material culture in the 19th century Cherokee history, in which the Americans did a survey, did a census of Cherokees in 1835. And they specifically were trying to estimate the value of goods that we owned, honestly, partly so they could figure out how much it would cost them to pay us for our stuff if they removed us. They were like, well, okay. They were basically treating it as if they were doing an eminent domain. And if they took our land or negotiated for our land, depending on how you see it, that they would have to pay us a certain amount for that, for the improvements to the land. So the land itself was held in common, but all your stuff, your buildings, your farms, your mills, your bridges, those are considered improvements that individuals or individual families had made. And that included things like how many people in your household can weave, how many people in your household are engaged in raising crops for sale, like cotton, versus crops for traditional sustenance, like corn, beans, and squash. And what's really fascinating to me was there was a table in one of the books I found that really analyzes this census or this assessment. And it was clear that the Americans expected there to be like a divide between what they termed in the book as mixed versus full-bloods in their access up to that amount of material culture. So whether you have people who can weave, whether you have cattle, all of that. Based on mixed versus full-blood status, the table does not have any distinction. It is exactly the same. And so there does appear to be a geographic difference. So if you were from essentially the equivalent of the highlands in Appalachia, areas and even now really only have coal mining and other kind of non-farm type of industries as their lifeblood, then it was harder to do things like have a traditional like row crop farm and have a bunch of cows. And so there were kind of distinctions, but they tended to be whether or not, like, how easy was it to actually live as if you lived in jolly old England or versus our communities that were more in the lowlands. So there seems to have been more of a geographic divide, which is just really fascinating to me to figure that out and kind of see, like, even then, even when they were trying to assess these things about us, the way they took that data suggested they believed there would be a distinction, and then they just didn't. It wasn't there. So going back onto track, our core choice here was we wanted to actively interrogate kind of romanticism about the 19th century, but then also avoid causing more harm to other people, because, like I said, a lot of the people who do this kind of work and costume in various levels, from all the way from personal to professional, some of them are doing it for bad reasons. Some of them wish they could have these rights over other people or more rights than other people, and we didn't. That was one of our core things, was to kind of avoid the moral harm to ourselves, that we not kind of accidentally give money and or take advice from white supremacists. The irony of having our skin tone is that many white people assume that we were on the same side, if you will. And I've even had people say things to me that were just horrifying. And I always thought, I know you said that because you thought that I would have the same feeling, but wow, is that really how you guys talk when you're unobserved by others, really? And the irony is those people, if they knew that I'm at a minimum mixed race, would probably be very distressed by that, because it really messes with their perception of what it means to be a white person. And also, they would at a minimum perceive that our white ancestors had, kind of demeaned themselves by marrying our incredibly awesome family, which is of course dumb.
I also do think, I don't want to skip over the idea that I think that a lot of people who have that romanticism about, let's say, dressing up like Vivian Leigh and kind of assuming that they can have all those trappings of that life and that wealth. I don't think that they necessarily think to themselves that system 100% has to depend upon enslaved labor to work. I think that I don't think that is the full thought. And like it is, I mean, maybe it is possible to run a cooperative farm that would create enough profit to allow for at least a pretend version of that lifestyle.
Yeah. So like, I mean, obviously there were other rich people in the universe.
Yeah. Like I just
didn't necessarily have a direct relationship to slavery, but I think what's important is, especially for when we're talking about, cotton-based wealth, whether or not your cotton was physically raised and picked and, sorted and, graded, et cetera, by enslaved labor. That whole economy and how big it got, as far as I know, really was dependent on, like, it wasn't possible to get to that scale. Yeah. And so, even as far away as like you go to England and go, well, we just had the cotton mills. We weren't raising the cotton with, all of our mills were being run by, impoverished people, but nobody was enslaved. Like, well, you don't have cotton to make the stuff to run your mill
without the basis,
without the slavery. Like, it's not, you wouldn't be able to make the math work.
Yeah. Well, and even from I think that the main thing is that, again, that removes it from its own history too much to say that, well, I just like the way this looks, or I just like this. And to say, well, I mean, like, the truth of the matter is that even Polly's later financial stability, the bedrock race for the mill that she made her living from was almost certainly dug by enslaved labor.
Yeah, so that's the other reason to be really intentional about making sure that as we kind of work to access that, the information that we need to interpret this project, and also just to try to inhabit anything that resembles her life, we have to recognize that we're participating in historical interpretation that in at least some ways relies on a system of violence and oppression. And even we'll get into it more when we talk specifically about the Dawes Rolls and how the really interesting stuff that we keep teasing the Dawes Rolls. But we'll talk about it more because those testimonies and the work people had to do to get on the Dawes Rolls is really fascinating and really gives some great firsthand testimony of what it was like for people who survived their enslavement and kind of, lived on and were able to speak up for themselves, advocate for themselves, like in 40 to 50 years later. So in order to eventually, some of them, as far as we can tell, secure a land allotment so they could have a base for generational wealth. And so that's sort of some of the positive stories out of it. But the bottom line is we wanted to be clear that participating in historical interpretation isn't an excuse to be transgressive by being racist or acting in a way that is inappropriate or, taking advantage of other people.
Yeah, so the sum up is that, you know, whether or not that system or that particular household or that particular dress could have been made a different way doesn't mean that you get away without recognizing and discussing the fact that it wasn't made in a different way. It was made in a way that was upon the bedrock foundation of a system that harmed people.